the Envoy stepped from her silver vessel onto the docking bay of the Galactic Empire, and the vast chamber of steel and glass greeted her with an oppressive silence. The floor was polished to a mirror sheen reflecting the harsh lights of alien suns filtered through colossal windows that framed the endless dark of space. Her every step echoed across the platform, slow, deliberate, steady, as though each sound was a declaration of her unbroken resolve. Her robes shimmered under the glare, marked with the crest of her people, an ancient sigil of peace woven with threads of silver and blue. The emblem caught the eye of every watcher, reminding them of a civilization that valued dialogue over war, and principle over conquest. Her presence was quiet yet commanding, for she carried not the weapons of soldiers, nor the arrogance of conquerors. She carried herself with the calm of purpose, and the dignity of one who bore the weight of countless lives upon her shoulders. Around her the air seemed tense, as if the docking bay itself resented her intrusion. Yet she continued forward, her face unflinching, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. She did not glance at the soldiers lining the walls, their armor dark and unyielding, their hands resting on weapons designed to silence dissent. Her stride was a message that she would not be intimidated, not here and not now. The Envoy had traveled across light years to be here, her journey marked by danger and the constant threat of interception. Her people were outnumbered and outgunned, their fleets scattered, their worlds at risk of falling into the iron grasp of the Empire. Still, she came alone, not because there were none who would accompany her, but because she believed the strength of a single voice could sometimes carry more weight than the roar of an army. She was determined to speak for those who could not speak for themselves, for those who had been silenced by fear or by force. The docking bay was not empty, though the silence made it feel like a tomb. Shadows moved along the edges, where imperial citizens had gathered to witness the arrival of the human envoy. Some gazed with curiosity, others with hostility, and still others with a sense of awe, that one so small compared to the Empire would dare to stand within its heart. Whispers rose and fell like the wind across barren stone. A human, they murmured, a human has come into the core. A human dares to stand before the Emperor. The Envoy did not answer the whispers, for her mission was not to respond to the crowd but to face the throne itself. Yet even in her silence her presence spoke volumes. She walked with purpose, and the people watching felt the weight of her courage pressing upon them. She did not move like one doomed to failure, but like one who carried the hope of stars. Every step drew her closer to the great doors that led into the imperial chamber. Those doors towered higher than any structure she had ever seen, carved of obsidian steel with symbols of conquest etched deep into their surface. They were symbols of victories past, reminders that the Empire had never lost and had never yielded. To many who looked upon those doors, fear took hold to her. They were nothing more than obstacles between her and her duty. She would walk through them with her head unbowed, and so the Envoy stood before the threshold of power. Her robes glimmering, her gaze unwavering, her spirit untamed. She drew a deep breath and stepped forward into the jaws of history. Crowds had gathered long before the Envoy arrived, drawn by whispers of something rare and impossible, a human stepping into the very core of the Empire. The docking bay and the adjoining halls swelled with onlookers, some summoned by curiosity, others ordered by their commanders, and a few compelled by the strange sense that history itself was unfolding before their eyes. The atmosphere trembled with anticipation and unease, as if the air itself understood that this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the station. The human envoy walked steadily through the wide corridor, her silver and blue robes shimmering with every measured step. The crest of her people glowed faintly against the metallic light, and its presence seemed to challenge the authority etched into every wall of the Empire. Citizens of countless worlds craned their necks to see her, their faces a mixture of fascination, suspicion, and quiet fear. A human among them was no common sight, and one who dared to stand before the Emperor was something beyond belief. Some whispered that she would not survive the day, their voices carrying the cruel certainty of those who had seen many vanish into the abyss of imperial justice. Others whispered with awe, calling her fearless, daring to name her a symbol of defiance against the vast machine of conquest. Her presence stirred thoughts long buried in the minds of those who had lived too long under the shadow of the throne. Thoughts of resistance, of rebellion, of change. Soldiers lined the corridors, their armor reflecting the cold glow of overhead lights. They stood in silence, their hands resting upon weapons, their expressions hidden behind steel masks. They were not there simply to protect, they were there as a reminder of the Empire's unyielding grip. The Envoy moved past them without pause, her gaze forward, her steps unwavering though she could feel the weight of their stares, pressing against her shoulders, like the pull of gravity itself. Children clung to their parents as the envoy passed, their wide eyes filled with wonder and confusion. For them the sight of her was not one of danger but of possibility, for in her stride they saw something few had ever witnessed within these walls, someone who walked unafraid beneath the banners of the Empire. The corridor opened into a vast antechamber where hundreds had gathered to watch her final approach. Above them, the ceiling stretched so high it seemed to vanish into darkness, banners of conquest hanging, like shadows of triumph over the ages. The envoy paused at the center of the chamber, letting the weight of countless eyes settle upon her. She stood tall, her robes catching the light, her expression calm yet fierce, and for a moment the silence became unbearably was then that whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into hushed voices rising like a tide through the hall. Some asked what fate awaited her, others wondered if she could sway the emperor himself, a few believed her words would vanish into the void, unheard and unremembered, yet others believed she carried with her something greater than words, a presence that could shake even the most unshakable throne. She did not speak to them, she did not raise her voice, for her message was not meant for the crowd but for the emperor, who waited beyond the colossal doors of the chamber. Still her silence carried power, for silence in the face of an empire was itself an act of defiance. The imperial guards at the door shifted their stance. As she approached the antechamber, falling into an uneasy hush, the envoy walked with the bearing of a queen, though she ruled no throne. Her footsteps were measured, her chin held high, her gaze unbroken. She was one woman among many, yet in that moment, she was larger than the empire itself. The great doors began to open, the grinding of their ancient machinery echoing through the chamber like the roar of a beast awakening from slumber. The envoy did not flinch, her heart steady, her purpose unshaken. She stepped toward the threshold, leaving behind the crowd and their whispers, leaving behind fear itself. She entered into the realm where her fate and the fate of countless others would be decided. The great chamber of the empire rose before the envoy like a mountain forged of steel and fire, vast beyond imagination and designed to crush the spirit of all who dared to enter. The walls reached high into the darkness, lined with banners woven from the spoils of countless conquests, each one telling the story of worlds that had fallen before the empire. In the center, a floor of black stone gleamed with the reflection of cold white light, while towering pillars carved with symbols of domination stretched like the ribs of a colossal beast holding the weight of authority. Above the far end of the chamber stood the throne, raised upon steps of obsidian metal and guarded by statues of warriors from ancient times. Their stone faces carried eternal expressions of cruelty, their weapons poised as if to strike down all who approached. The throne itself was a marvel of intimidation, sculpted from black iron, laced with veins of red crystal that pulsed faintly like the beating heart of a slumbering giant, and upon it sat the Emperor of the Galactic Empire, cloaked in darkness, his form draped in heavy robes lined with gold and crimson. His crown was not a simple ornament but a helm of war, forged from the remnants of a long-dead world. The light caught its edges, casting shadows across his face, leaving only his piercing eyes visible. They burned with the weight of centuries, unblinking and merciless. He did not rise to greet the envoy, nor did he nod in acknowledgement. Instead, he watched her approach with the stillness of a predator waiting for prey to step closer to its jaws. Around him gathered the council, their robes flowing like rivers of shadow, whispering softly among themselves. Their voices slithered through the air like restless serpents, yet none spoke loud enough to be heard clearly. They judged her with their eyes, measuring her every movement as though seeking the flaw that would justify her destruction. Some leaned forward, curious, some recoiled in disdain, and a few simply stared with cold detachment. The envoy stepped onto the polished stone floor, her reflection stretching beneath her feet like a ghost of herself. She felt the weight of the chamber pressing upon her as though the empire itself sought to break her spirit before she could utter a word. Still she lifted her chin, her eyes fixed upon the throne. She carried herself not as a supplicant but as an equal standing before power, not in fear but in duty. Each step echoed through the chamber, a rhythm of defiance against the silence of the empire. The guards who lined the hall shifted slightly, their hands upon their weapons, but none dared to move without command. Their armor gleamed under the stark light, their presence a reminder of the violence that waited just beyond the edge of patience. The envoy reached the base of the steps leading to the throne. She paused there, standing tall, her robes flowing around her like waves of silver and blue against the backdrop of the Empire's grandeur. She seemed small and fragile, yet in that moment her presence filled the hall more than the banners, more than the statues, even more than the throne itself. The Emperor leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as silence deepened, pressing like a weight upon every soul present. The envoy did not bow, she did not kneel. She stood with unyielding resolve, ready to speak for her people, ready to confront the power that sought to crush them. She had entered the heart of darkness, and she would not be diminished. The silence of the chamber stretched like the void between stars, heavy and unbroken. As the envoy stood before the throne, she could feel the weight of countless eyes fixed upon her, the eyes of soldiers, of counselors, of the emperor himself. Yet, she did not falter. She breathed deeply, steadying the fire in her chest, and when she raised her voice it rang clear through the vast hall, cutting through the oppressive quiet like a blade drawn from its sheaths. She spoke of peace, not as a plea but as a path, a way forward that could bind to civilizations instead of tearing them apart. She spoke of futures not yet written, of children growing without fear of war, of worlds flourishing without the shadow of conquest. Her words carried conviction, for they were not crafted by poets, nor designed to flatter the pride of emperors. They were born from necessity and from the will of a people who had endured the cruelty of the empire too long. She did not promise submission, she promised partnership. She did not speak of surrender, she spoke of coexistence. The banners hanging above seemed to stir, as if uneasy with the truth of her voice. The guards who lined the walls shifted their stance, as though uncertain of whether to laugh at her boldness or remain still. The council whispered again, their voices rising in agitation, some sneering at her audacity, others murmuring in grudging admiration. A human stood in the heart of the empire, and dared to speak as though she were an equally, and words grew sharper. As she spoke of the cost of war, she painted pictures with her voice of shattered planets and burning skies, of empires stretching themselves so thin in conquest that they became hollow and brittle within. She warned them not as an enemy but as one who had studied the paths of history. Her people had endured and learned, and they had seen what became of powers that sought dominion over all. They fell not by the strength of others but by the weight of their own arrogance. For a brief moment the chamber seemed to tremble with the power of her words. The emperor sat motionless, his eyes burning with unreadable thought. Yet the envoy could feel his gaze like a blade pressed against her throat. She did not waver, she lifted her chin higher, her voice ringing louder, and with it the council stirred uneasily. Some leaned forward as though drawn by her strength, others recoiled as though stung by her defiancy. Ended her speech not with a plea but with a vow that her people would not bow nor vanish nor be erased from the stars. They would endure as they always had. They would endure even in the shadow of an empire that thought itself eternal. Her final words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, echoing long after her lips had closed. The chamber remained still, the emperor unmoved, the council whispering like restless serpents. Yet in that silence one truth became undeniable. The envoy had spoken with the voice of her people, and her words could not be unspoken. The emperor sat unmoving upon his throne, his shadow stretching across the obsidian steps like the hand of fate. His eyes burned with a light that revealed nothing yet promised everything. He let the silence linger, twisting it into a chain meant to bind the envoy in doubt and fear. Still, she stood unbowed, her gaze steady, her robes flowing softly as though moved by a wind that existed only for her. The council stirred uneasily, their whispers rising into a low tide of dissent. Some called her words dangerous, others dismissed them as the desperate cries of a weaker race. A few, however, remained quiet, their faces turned toward the envoy with an expression that was not yet agreement, but was no longer pure disdain. The chamber pulsed, with unease like a storm waiting to break, but it was the emperor's voice that would decide its course. At last he spoke, his voice low and resonant, filling the chamber like the toll of a great bell. He said that peace was a word spoken only by those too weak to claim victory. He said that coexistence was the dream of the conquered, not the law of the conqueror. He said that her presence within the empire was not a gesture of courage, but a trespass against the natural order of power. Each word struck the air like a hammer, shattering the fragile hope. Her speech had kindled. The council responded in waves. Some nodded vigorously, others hissed in dark approval. Their whispers turned to murmurs, and then two sharp phrases echoing through the chamber. Her offer of peace had been transformed in their mouths into an insult, into defiance, into a challenge against the empire itself. The Envoy did not move. She listened to the emperor's condemnation with the patience of stone. Her eyes remained fixed on his throne, and when he paused, she raised her voice again, soft yet clear, carrying through the noise of the council. She told him that power built only on fear could never last forever. She told him that empires that silenced voices of peace would one day find themselves silenced in return. The words cut through the chamber, and for an instant it seemed the emperor would answer. But instead he leaned back upon his throne, the fire in his eyes growing colder. The chamber darkened with his silence, and the council felt the weight of his unspoken judgment. Guards shifted their stances, ready for the command they knew would come. The air itself thickened heavy with expectation. The envoy knew then that her words had not softened the empire but sharpened its wrath. Yet she did not retreat, nor did she regret what she had spoken. She stood upon the polished floor, her reflection gleaming like a ghost beneath her feet. She had carried the truth of her people into the jaws of power, and no condemnation, no silence, and no threat could take that truth away. The emperor raised one hand, slowly, deliberate as the turning of a star. The council fell silent, the guards tensed, the chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. Her fate hung in that single gesture, waiting for the command that would seal her destiny. The hand of the emperor fell with the weight of a star, and the command needed no words. The guards moved as one, their heavy armor clattering like the grinding of ancient machines. They descended the steps, their weapons gleaming cold under the light of the chamber, and the sound of their approach echoed like thunder rolling through a storm. The envoy did not move. She stood calm, her chin lifted, her gaze steady, as though the shadow of death was only another trial to endure. The council leaned forward, their whispers sharpening into cruel anticipation. Some smiled thinly, some sneered, and others turned their eyes away, not from pity but from fear of what they knew was inevitable. The banners above seemed to darken the chamber, heavy with the history of those who had stood before the empire and been broken by its hand. The envoy was about to join them, yet still she stood, unshaken. The first guard reached her, his weapon raised, the polished steel caught the light, and for a moment the chamber itself seemed to freeze in that reflection. The envoy looked into the face of her executioner, though his mask revealed no human expression, and she did not flinch. His blade struck swift and hard, tearing through the folds of her robe, and the breath of the chamber faltered as crimson bloomed against the polished stone floor. She staggered but did not fall. Her eyes burned with fire, brighter than pain, brighter than fear. The second guard struck her across the shoulder, and her body bent beneath the force, yet her spirit did not break. She remained upright, her voice silent, but her defiance thundered louder than any cry. She looked not at the guards but at the emperor and his council, her gaze a challenge that pierced deeper than any blade. The people who had gathered in the shadows of the chamber gasped, though none dared to speak. Some felt shame. Others felt rage, and still others felt something they could not name. A single envoy, a single fragile life had dared to confront the empire, and even as her blood stained the stone, she remained more powerful in that moment than all the banners that hung above. The third blow struck her across the back, and her knees buckled against the floor. The sound of impact rang like a drumbeat of finality, yet she caught herself upon one hand, her robes pooling around her, her hair falling loose across her face. She lifted her head once more and rose again, unsteady yet unbroken. Her will stood where her body faltered, and in her defiance the chamber quivered with unease. The guards circled her, now ready to finish their task. Their weapons gleamed mercilessly, their movements sure, but she stood tall once more, her figure small against the immensity of the empire, yet luminous. With unyielding strength she had come to speak for her people, and even in this moment of violence, she was still speaking without words. She was telling them that truth could bleed, but it would not vanish. The emperor watched unmoved, his eyes colder than the void between stars. The council shifted uneasily, some satisfied, others unsettled. The envoy swayed upon her feet, crimson trailing in her wake, and yet she remained a figure unbroken by fear. She had been struck, she had been wounded, but her spirit shone brighter than ever. As the empire sought to silence her, the chamber hung in silence, broken only by the sound of the envoy's ragged breath. Her body trembled, her robes torn and stained, yet her spirit still glowed like a star, refusing to fade. The guards stood close, their weapons poised for the final strike, but they hesitated, as if bound by something they could not name. Perhaps awe, perhaps fear, perhaps the weight of her defiance. The council shifted uneasily, their whispers returning, though softer now, uncertain. Some muttered that she should be ended swiftly to erase her presence from memory. Others whispered that no execution could erase what she had already done for her voice. had entered their ears, and her strength had burned into their sight. She was no longer only a woman, she had become a symbol, and symbols could not be slain so easily. The envoy lifted her head, her hair falling back from her face, and her eyes locked with the emperor once more. They burned with pain, yet brighter still with unyielding fire. Her voice, though weakened, carried across the chamber, firm, steady, sharp. She told them she was not afraid. She told them that she would not kneel. She told them that her people would endure beyond this hall, beyond this moment, beyond even her death. Her words rang like bells through the darkness, and the chamber quivered beneath their sound. The banners seemed to shift, as though stirred by a hidden wind. The guards themselves faltered, their grip on weapons tightening, yet their stance uncertain. For the first time in countless ages, the empire itself felt the presence of defiance, not from an army, not from a fleet, but from a single soul. The emperor leaned forward upon his throne, his eyes narrowing, the fire within them sharpening to a blade, yet he did not speak. His silence was heavier than any command, and the council felt its weight pressing upon them. Some tried to meet the envoy's gaze and failed. Others looked away, ashamed or unsettled, for her strength reflected their weakness, and her courage revealed their cowardice. The envoy raised a trembling hand, not in defense, not in surrender, but in declaration. She pointed toward the banners that hung above, symbols of conquest, and told them they would not last forever. She said, "Every empire falls, not by the will of its enemies, but by the rot of its own arrogance." She said that today they struck her, but tomorrow the stars themselves would rise against them. Her words were not prophecy, yet they carried the force of truth that no power could erase. The chamber shuddered with her defiance. The council fell silent. The guards stood frozen. The emperor remained still, yet the tension in the air grew heavy, as if the very walls themselves bore witness to a truth too powerful to deny. She had been struck down, she had been broken in body, yet in spirit she stood taller than the throne itself. Her eyes swept across the chamber, meeting every gaze without fear. Her body wavered, but her presence was unshakable in that moment. She was not only the envoy of her people, she was the voice of all who had suffered under the empire, the voice of all who had been silenced, forgotten, or erased. She was the living embodiment of defiance, and even in her final hour she made the empire tremble. The envoy swayed upon her feet, her breath shallow, her body breaking, yet her spirit burned brighter with every passing heartbeat. The guards waited for the emperor's final command, but none came, and in that hesitation, the envoy found her last moment of strength. The chamber hung in silence, as though the very air was listening, waiting for the words she would speak before the darkness claimed her. She lifted her face, her eyes fierce though clouded with pain, and her voice rose clear though faint, carrying across the chamber like the last cry of a dying star. She told them they had chosen violence when peace was within their grasp. She told them they had struck her body but not her people. She told them they had silenced her voice, but they would never silence the truth that lived beyond these walls, beyond this throne, beyond even the empire itself. The guards shifted uneasily, their weapons lowered but not yet withdrawn. The council murmured in confusion, their whispers no longer sharp with cruelty but heavy with unease. Some stared at her with contempt, others with pity, and a few with a dawning recognition that they had witnessed something greater than themselves. The emperor alone remained still, his eyes fixed upon her, with the cold weight of eternity. The envoy drew one final breath, her chest trembling with the effort. Her voice weakened, yet it carried more force than any command. She declared that every action carried consequence, and every cruelty bore a price. She declared that the empire would pay, not by her hand, but by the will of the stars, by the will of all those who had suffered under its chains. Her words cut through the chamber, and the silence shattered as though struck by thunder. "There will be consequences," she said, her voice low but unyielding, her eyes blazing as though fire itself lived within them. The words echoed against the towering walls, and the sound lingered long after her lips had closed. They were not only words, they were a vow, a curse, a truth that wrapped itself around the heart of every soul present. The chamber grew heavy with those words. The guards faltered as though struck by an invisible force. The council froze their whispers, stilled. The banners above seemed to sag under the weight of prophecy, and the throne itself seemed to darken, as though the truth of her declaration had pierced even the emperor's silence. The envoy's body wavered, her knees buckling, yet she remained upright for one last moment, her spirit defying gravity itself. Then her strength gave way and she collapsed to the floor. Her robes spread around her like the petals of a dying flower, her blood pooling upon the polished stone. Her eyes remained open, her gaze still fixed upon the throne, unbroken. Even in death she had fallen, but her presence remained carved into the chamber, like fire burned into stutha. Silence that followed was unlike any silence before. It was not the silence of fear, nor the silence of reverence. It was the silence of a truth too great to ignore, a silence that carried the weight of her last words. There will be consequences. The envoy's body lay still upon the polished floor, her blood spreading like a crimson shadow across the stone. The chamber remained frozen in silence. Not a whisper, not a movement, only the echo of her final words, drifting like smoke through the air. There will be consequences. The phrase lingered in every ear, in every heart, in every corner of the hall, and no one could deny its weight there. Guards stood uncertain, their weapons still drawn, but their purpose hollow. Their armor gleamed, but their confidence faltered, for they had struck her down, yet her spirit remained unbroken. The council shifted uneasily, their whispers gone, replaced with fear and doubt. Some stared at her lifeless form with satisfaction, others with unease, and a few with a flicker of guilt that gnawed at them like a hidden wound. The emperor alone sat unmoving upon his throne, his eyes burning cold, but deeper than cold lay something else, a shadow of thought that no one could read. Beyond the chamber, news spread faster than light, carried by whispers, carried by signals, carried by the voices of those who had seen. Her death could not be contained, for witnesses had already spoken, and soon the message traveled across the empire. The envoy had come unarmed to speak of peace, and she had been struck down. Her final words became a flame that leaped from world to world, igniting hearts with rage and sorrow. On distant colonies, humans gathered in secret, their grief sharpening into resolve. They swore that her sacrifice would not be forgotten, and her final words became their rallying cry on allied worlds beyond human space. The story spread among those who had long suffered under the empire. They whispered of the envoy who stood unbowed and declared consequences. With her last breath, they began to see themselves in her defiance and in her death. They found the seed of rebellion. The empire tried to silence the tale, branding her a traitor, branding her words as lies, but truth once spoken could not be erased. The more they tried to bury her memory, the more it grew. The banners of conquest that had hung untouched for centuries began to feel fragile beneath the weight of her defiance. The throne itself, though vast and eternal, began to seem less certain, less unshakable, for a single voice had pierced its silence, and a single death had shaken its foundation among the stars. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into vows, and vows into action. Fleets began to stir, and secret alliances formed in shadows. Revolts sparked like embers scattered across the void. The empire still reigned, vast and unyielding, but within its borders unrest spread like cracks in stone. And at the heart of it all was the memory of the envoy, the woman who walked unarmed into the throne of power, the woman who spoke of peace and refused to kneel, the woman who, with her last breath, promised that there would be consequences. Her body had fallen, her voice had ended, but her spirit had become immortal, carried by every star, every whisper, every rising flame of resistance. The galaxy would never forget her, and the empire would never escape the truth of her final words. There will be consequences.